Hello, everyone, and welcome to the last episode of Worlds Between Words. I'm Aisha Ahmed. I'm a MA graduate from the University of Leeds, and this is Diko, who is also an MA graduate from the University of Leeds.
She's right,
Uh,
I am.
Today, we'll be discussing two short stories: A Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe, which I'll be dealing with mainly, and A Good Man is Hard to Find by some other guy whose name I don't
No,
remember.
no, it's not a guy, it's a woman. Flannery O'Connor. Well, it's not your text. I suppose that's why you didn't care to learn who it is by. But yeah,
No.
you're right. A good man is hard to find. That's going to be my text. And yeah, we're just going to we're going to go through the different aspects of the text. And at the end, I'm sure you'll be convinced my book is way better and is so much sexier than Aisha's book. So just, vote Deco.
Right.
That's
So
that's what's up.
just so we're all clear, he picked both texts, yeah? Like
And you think I gave you the bad one.
so let's get right into it. My book comes first, because it was written first. So Edgar Allan Poe wrote A Telltale Heart in 1843 and he got $10 for it. Um
Wow, all that for him.
yeah. Well, in all fairness, at the time, this is $10 wasn't a bad amount of money. So,
That's what I was gonna say. Inflation, right?
yep. So about Edgar Allan Poe. He's incredibly famous. He's the guy who wrote he's the reason why we say quoth the raven nevermore. Which if you've watched Wednesday, the Addams Family spin-off thing, then is quoted a lot in that one. He was according to a lot of people, the reason why Romanticism was such a big thing in America, because Romanticism was primarily like the Romantic period was primarily, set off by Britain. But he was an American writer, and there's definitely like very heavy Gothic influence in his work. So, the macabre and mystery and that sort of thing, which we discussed quite a bit about in last week's text, Dracula. And A Telltale Heart is quite similar to that. It has a lot of macabre things. It also has mental illness and just straight up like this idea of monsters in real life, that sort of vibe going on with it. So, about A Telltale Heart. A Telltale Heart begins in medias res, which means it begins in the middle of the action. It begins with almost a conversational tone, and there are loads of exclamation marks throughout the text. We begin with true, and then he goes on to tell you what is true about it. And he talks about his insanity. And he's like, no, I am completely sane, guys. Look, I am super sane. And this is why I am sane. I did the murder so cleverly. I was so clever as I was doing it. But what he describes as clever is just cautious. And he seems to think that that is reason enough to prove that he isn't insane. Now, a lot of people have speculated that he has some sort of schizophrenia or he's just paranoid. Some people have theorized that the narrator is a servant of the old man that he kills, or it's the child of the old man that he kills. Different interpretations. Some people argue that it's a woman rather than a man because there are no pronouns used, because it is, in fact, in first person.
Yeah, so I'm gonna tell you about a little bit about my text, which is unlike Aisha's text, it's not about murders and crazy people, or is it? Yeah, so my text is a good man is hard to find by Flannery O'Connor. Flannery O'Connor writes particularly what critics have called Southern Gothic literature. So not far removed from what Edgar Allan Poe would write, although quite different in the sense that O'Connor's primarily focusing on um, uh, the Southern American setting. So her texts also feature, and this kind of reflects on her faith as a Roman Catholic. She brings in sort of religious perspective into her writing, and you can see how that influences the motif of some of the texts that she has written. She's written several short stories and two whole novels. And this particular text, A Good Man is Hard to Find, she published in 1953, first in 1953, and subsequently it appears in a lot of anthologies. Personally, I think it's an interesting text because the one thing I really like about this text is that you go through it and you almost don't want to believe that what is happening is actually happening, right? Like people are getting killed, but you're like, they're not killed, they're just getting ice cream. But deep down, you know that something is not right because as you read the text, it becomes more and more obvious that something really dark, really sinister, and really horrific is happening. And yeah, we're gonna come to more of that when we discuss the plot. So um, that's in general about the style of writing that typifies O'Connor's text, the Southern Gothic or Southern Realism, as it's sometimes called. Um, and you see it not only in the subject or the themes of the text that O'Connor writes, but also in the language that is used. So you see the accent, very heavily Southern accents, in the characters when they speak. And we're going to come to more of that when we talk about the style and so on. So first of all, for today, analyzing the texts, Aisha's going to tell us a little bit about the plot structure of her novel, kind of how the storyline goes, and what particular points in the story are significant and how the story kind of shifts from one point to another. So Aisha, you can take it away. The stage is all yours again. Wow.
Thank you, Jacob. Um, right. So, A Telltale Heart. As I said, it begins with an exclamation mark and it ends with an exclamation mark. It is chock full of exclamation marks. The punctuation is really interesting in this story because it goes from short, stabby sentences and moves on to long, flowing sentences that are broken by a heavy usage of hyphenation. So loads of like long dashes and things like that, like as though the narrator is tripping from one thought to the next, that he can't get his words out fast enough. But it begins with short, clipped sentences, as though he's trying to say, "Look, I am so rational. I'm not speaking." Um, I'm not speaking overly loquaciously. I'm saying things in a very concise manner, and that must mean that I am rational. You must believe me. I'm not crazy. But the thing is, it begins with an exclamation mark. It begins with an exclamation mark without any prologue, epilogue, whatever. It begins, like I said, in medias res. He says, "I'm not true. I killed the guy, but I'm not crazy. I didn't kill the guy because I'm crazy. No, no, no. I had reasons." And then he goes on to say that, "Well, I'm not entirely certain what the reason was, because it's not like I wanted his money or anything. Because I didn't. I don't care about his money. And it's not like I hated the guy. I didn't hate him. Um, oh, it must have been his eye." And that's how he says it. He describes it, this is the sort of thought progression that occurs. Like he's trying to figure it out as he's explaining it to the character. Sorry, the reader. So he's explaining, the narrator, this is in first person point of view. So we get only his perspective. And it's fairly obvious from the get-go that his perspective isn't exactly what one would call reliable. So he's an unreliable narrator who has a very limited idea of what's going on around him, or at least in large part, it might just be because he wants to give us a limited idea of what's going on. From the very beginning, it's like, look, yes, you're right. I did kill the guy, but I'm here to convince you that I was not at fault, that there was a reason why I did this. So this is not just it's not just a story, it's a rhetorical device. It's a persuasive text. It's trying to persuade you into believing the narrator's innocence, which is hard to do because he's describing a murder. But nevertheless, he's saying that, oh, it was his evil eye that I hated. It wasn't anything about the guy himself. The guy was really nice. So, there's no rational reason why I would kill him. If I was a bad person, I'd kill him because I was greedy. If I was, if he was a bad person, if he abused me or something like that. No. He was a nice guy. That wasn't the problem. So then the reason I killed him is because of something supernatural. So I can't be a bad person. I haven't killed him because of any moralistic reason. I killed him for a very purposeful, higher purpose reason. So you have to believe this about me. I wouldn't have done it if I was a bad guy. I did this because there was something metaphysically wrong with this old man. He describes the old man as having a light blue vulture-like eye, the evil eye, and evil and eye are both the E's are capitalized in these things. Now, as I'm sure most of you know, there's a whole mythology just behind an evil eye. Oh, this guy's looked at you with an evil eye, so bad luck's going to follow you. You might die. Bad things happen to people who have the evil eye. So by saying that he, like this old man had the evil eye, he's trying to frame his murder victim as a villain, and that he was someone who was. He doesn't say anything about saving other people from the evil eye. He's saying that this is something that I did, and he doesn't. And it's implied that it was for himself. It's implied though. It's not even forcefully, subtly implied. It's like it's a background thing. You must logic out the reason why he would even think to do this. He kills the old man, he dismembers him, and he tells us, that, oh, look at how smart I was. I dismembered him in the tub. There was no blood for me to clean up, guys. I killed him in a bathtub. I am so smart. And I hid him under loose floorboards. And at 4 o'clock when the police came, I was the most calm. You would not believe how calm I was. And that's the kind of, almost conversational dialogue he has going on with the reader. He's saying, you would not believe, guys. I just took them around. I was so confident in myself. I put my chair right over the guy's corpse. Hey, I'm just too good, is basically how he was talking, if you want to translate it into today's lingo. I said lingo. Anyway, I'm done with the
What she
quote,
did.
right?
You're done with the kids.
Yeah. But yeah, and then but then he starts hearing a ticking sound coming from the first what he thinks is in his own head. He's having a headache, and head's ticking, tick 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 sound. But then he realizes that it's the same ticking sound he heard of the old man's heart. And the exact phrase is repeated, but in italics the second time. So when he's first describing the old man's ticking heart, when the old man realizes that there's someone in the room with him, after 7 nights of watching him in the middle of the night, on the 8th day, he realizes there's someone watching him. The narrator says, I could hear him. I could hear how hard his heart was beating. I could hear it. And he's so gleeful about it as well. I totally freaked him out. I'm so good at this. He didn't even know it was me, but he was so freaked out. You wouldn't believe how, slow and cautious I was, but he still didn't figure out it was me. But he uses the exact same sentence he used to describe the old man's heart beating there, but in italics at basically almost like in the penultimate paragraph of explanation in italics. And the repetition, you know, normally has the effect of being, oh, this is a horror movie. This is something that happened before. It's being brought back now. It's almost like Chekhov's gun. It's a motif. It's like no, it's a device, it's a plot device used to increase the horror in a scene. That, oh my God, this is back, but in a different context. Because the guy is dead, his heart should not be beating, and that's what freaks the narrator out, and he confesses to his crime. It's a very short story, so every word, and that's the whole point of a short story. Every word is deliberated upon. It's deliberate. So every word has to build on to the next thing. No word can be superfluous. So yeah, so the thing about unreliable narrators is that they could be doing anything, they could have said anything, and you can interpret just based on reading between the lines is a large part of unreliable narrators when you want the truth of their tale. And yeah, I think we can do comparatives, but after Diego goes through his a good man is hard to find.
Thank you, Aisha. That's really brilliant. Thank you so much. I mean, you did really point out at a lot of things that I would like to pick up on. But yeah, like you said, I would like to go and also go over some of the same parameters that you went over in discussing your own text. So a good man is hard to find. The text opens with a grandmother who is very, very, unhappy that her family is going away to Florida for a vacation. She says, "Well, the kids should go to other places. We've been to Florida already. What's the point? Let's go to Tennessee." But the point is, she does want to go to Tennessee. She does not want to go to Florida. This is, if you like, the conflict. I think this is where the conflict comes, because this singular intention of the grandmother leads her to tell a story as they're on their way to go to Florida, to tell a story that makes them detour into a dirt road. And on that dirt road, because also she carries the cat, the family cat, she told them that there's a house with a secret compartment or whatever. And if they get to that secret compartment, there's treasure in it. And the kids get so excited that they convince their father. He says, while they're on their way to Florida, the father says, "Okay, fine, let's go to this secret house with a secret whatever. Let's go see it." And she's happy, right? She's happy because this is what she's wanted always. And so they do that. They get on the dirt road. The cat pops out. The father loses control of the vehicle, and they have an accident. Now, if you notice the story at the beginning, the grandmother already wants to go to Tennessee, and she does everything she can to, make them take that detour that leads them off their course to somewhere other than where they originally want to go, which is Florida, or where the dad wants them to go. And at this point in the story, after the accident, another character that appears right at the beginning of the story, who's the misfit, one of the ploys that the grandmother tried to use to make sure that the father, who's Bailey, does not go to Florida, is that she says, "Well, look at this criminal. He's out and he's probably going to be somewhere near Florida. You don't want to take us to Florida." But when they have the accident, what do you know? Because it's a secluded part of the road. No cars travel there mostly. The misfit and his gang had been somewhere close to where they crashed, and they see the family crash into the forest. And when this happens, the misfit and his gang kind of come over, drive down to the family, and they're like, "Oh, so it looks like you've had an accident." Now, the storyline, if you want to follow it as it goes along, and some of the things that we like to point out in literature, you could say at the beginning you have the exposition where you have the grandmother and the father and the kids and the mother. You see all the characters in the story except for the misfit who comes in later on. And this is always the case in literature. You cannot have, it's not possible always to have everyone in the story right at the beginning as the story develops. Actually, one of the things with characterization is that the way that characters build, the way that authors build characters is usually the way that they build the story, so that you cannot have a story without having characters being developed. But the point is, right at the beginning, we get to know the father, Bailey. We get to know the kids who are very nasty. For the grandmother, these are not really nice kids, but everyone who sees them seems to think they're cute kids. First impressions, at least, they look not very evil, but they say very nasty things, and we get to see more of that as the story unfolds. So the point is, you have the exposition where you meet the family, they get on the road, and also part of that exposition, as I said, is the conflict where the grandmother does not want to go to Tennessee, does not want to go to Florida, like her son Bailey wants to go to Florida. And she takes the cat with them. Part of the rising action, if you like, where tension builds up is when the grandmother realizes, oh no, I told him to take this road. This is the road that leads to the house. It's actually the wrong road. And she kind of fidgets a bit and her leg moves and kind of tickles the cat, or the cat jumps out and they crash. The crashing is the climax, I think. I think there are perhaps other points in the story that arguably could serve as a climax, but I think when the car crashes, that's partly, if not the climax, but building up to that climax and very close to it. The misfit, as I say, so they found out about this misfit in the newspaper when the grandmother throws it at her son, Bailey. So of course, everyone in the whole county is tense because they know that there's a criminal on the loose and he can just pounce on anybody at any time wherever he's hiding. Unluckily for them, he pounces on them, and then he comes with his boys. Like, he looks like he had an accident. He asks, this is the misfit, asks one of the boys in his gang to look at the car, just see what's wrong. And he was kind of all too friendly with them. But then the grandmother just says, oh, you're the misfit. Her son, Bailey, turns around and goes, well, he says something very vile to his grandmother that shocks everybody, including the misfit. He's like, oh, usually people don't mean what they say. He tries to kind of console her. But he did say to the grandmother, I wish you had not recognized me, because that's really problematic for him because she has recognized him. And a loose criminal does not want to leave people who can, point him out, especially when they're in a place where he can shut them up. And this is a ruthless, ruthless man. And this is what I was saying right at the beginning of the show when I was talking about like the level of grotesqueness and just vile brutality of this misfit. Almost it almost leads you to kind of say, he's not killing them actually, but he does. First, he sends off Bailey and the boy. So Bailey has a son, John something, right?
Wesley.
And John Wesley. Thank you very much, Aisha. So John Wesley and Bailey get sent into the forest, and you see them going in. You're like, yeah, maybe he's just sending them up because he wants to say something or whatever. Personally, I really didn't want to believe that actually they were being killed, even when I hear the gunshots, because I'm thinking like, okay, this is probably just some kind of ploy. There's just a plot twist here. They're gonna come back, emerge from the thicket, but they don't. And the two guys come and they pick up the mother and June Star, the young girl, John Wesley's sister, and they go into the forest too. And they keep getting shot and getting shot and getting shot. And I think part of the falling action is perhaps, so at this point, most of them are being killed. Part of the falling action is when the grandmother is also killed. she says to the misfit, she touches him, and then he just recoils. The grandmother gets shot, and she gets shot. That's kind of the end of it for her, and kind of like the end of the story. And we see, some people have pointed out that the misfit at this point, at the end of the story, kind of gets a different, or takes on a different moral position. But I don't know how much we can read into these things. And so because I'm just discussing the plot structure of the text, that will be kind of mostly what I would say about that aspect. In terms of the writing narrative style, it is written in the third person. But mostly, Aisha last week talked about third person focalized, and you can see it very well in this text. And I think you can see it mostly in short stories, because usually the character count is not that many. There aren't so many characters, right? There's just a few of them, and it would typically be following one person's perspective, even if it is as it is in this case, written in the third person. So the grandmother is followed for the most part, and then we kind of move away from that and move to the misfit right at the end, only at the end, when he talks to his other gang members. So that's mostly it for in general, the narrative style. It's kind of that. Partly what I wanted to say about the what's it called, about the plot structure is that you find my students kind of pointed this out to me, that there's a lot of foreshadowing. So it's subtle, but when you read it closely and you see some of the signs of how horrible it's going to go for them all. They talk about the hearse, the car being described as a hearse-like vehicle. Hearse. So the car is used to carry coffins. There's also the throwaway comment that the narrator makes about the grandmother being, even if she's dead at the side of the road, she'll at least look like a lady, also signaling something there. But I think for probably as far as foreshadowing goes, I don't know how convincing that is all, but all in all, it's a suspenseful story, a lot like The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe is. And I think short stories kind of do that. They can do that. Aisha talks about the economy of how authors treat words. A Telltale Heart is almost twice, probably more than twice, it's probably half the size of, even less than half the size of the length, if you like, of A Good Man Is Hard to Find. So in these short stories, usually the authors are very careful with the way they use words. They're very deliberate. Each word is carefully picked out. It's carefully placed, and serves so much purpose. Serves so much purpose, and has a lot of symbolism in it. Now, Aisha, I don't know. In terms of comparison, I think you can see the comparison in terms of, I suppose, I don't know, the murder in the two texts. There's a lot of killing. There's a lot of just and also, well, in A Good Man Is Hard to Find, if it is a play, all of it would happen off stage, right? No murder, only the grandmother's mother. The grandmother's murder takes place there, right in front of the reader. But all the other characters kind of are shot away from the position where the action is happening. But it's kind of different in A Telltale Heart. Aisha, how do you think it compares in terms of the level of grotesqueness? O'Connor has been described as, writing grotesque stories, and this is one of her most famous texts. But how do you think she compares to Mr. Poe, Magic Poe? Just what level of violence do we see in A Telltale Heart that you think perhaps we don't see in A Good Man Is Hard to Find, or you see more in A Good Man Is Hard to Find? This is not a competition, but by all means.
if it was a competition, Edgar Allan Poe wins. So
And
yeah, obviously it isn't a
you
competition.
you wipe
Uh,
the floor with O'Connor.
Pretty much. No, the thing about Flannery O'Connor's text is, well, her a good man is hard to find. The narrative voice, if you will. So the tone, the word choices, the things that she chooses to show rather than the things that an author chooses to show and not show are equally important. And the choices that O'Connor makes with A Good Man is Hard to Find is very in line with the characterization of the grandmother. There's a certain sense of decorum to the text. The idea that, these murders don't happen on screen, they happen off screen, adds a level of horror. The horror aspect increases when something is happening off stage. Like it's happening off stage and it's only implied by just, sounds or noises. The implication of grotesque violence in some ways has more of an impact than just, look, someone's slashing and hacking bodies on screen. The mystery of it increases the intellectual, like the need for the reader to have an intellectual attachment to the text, because they now have to interpret it. Like it's an interpretation. It's not just, like, oh, and then he went and shot Bailey and John Wesley, and then he went and shot the mother's children and June Star. So it's not like, obviously that can be written in a far more elegant manner, but you, as you said, you almost don't want to believe it, and you're given the leeway not to believe it until the very end. And that, the slow dawning horror, especially if you genuinely believe Misfit hasn't killed anybody, um the dawning horror of it in a psychological manner impacts more heavily than any hack and slash thing would. um because when violence is gratuitous violence decreases the horror of that violence, decreases the impact of that violence, because it's just constantly happening. And along with, as we've discussed, I think in the first lecture, suspension of disbelief is one thing that a reader naturally has to go into a text with, and an author has to work really hard not to remove remove the reader from the suspension of disbelief. But another thing that another aspect of suspension of disbelief is the ability for humans to get used to anything. If this text had begun with, oh yeah, and then he killed this person and that person, the casual manner of it would have reduced the grotesqueness of the murders in the end. So by having it almost disclosed from the reader increases the pathos, the emotional impact of their death. Even if you don't necessarily care about them, it becomes more horrific because it's, the grandmother doesn't want to believe it until she dies herself.
I think you're right. The point about not wanting to believe it till the very end almost intensifies. This is what it does. So there's a literary device in literature called suspense, right? Where an author kind of builds suspense in the reader, and I think this happens brilliantly in A Good Man Is Hard to Find. It's kind of like an intrigue. Okay, what's gonna happen? What's gonna happen? You're seeing people going behind the bushes. You're hearing the sounds of the guns, but you almost don't want to believe it because of how, till that point, almost everything is normal in a way. People crash in cars all the time. Strangers stop by to help them all the time, and the first thing they do when the car crashes, the misfit tells one of his boys to look in the car, right? Like, what's wrong with the car? You kind of assume, oh, he's actually not that bad a person. Maybe he just you know, maybe his bad things that he does is just stealing apples or whatever. I can't. It might have been mentioned at the start of the text that he is a vicious killer, but at that very point in the story, you almost want to forget everything else and kind of believe the best of the misfit, that he might not be the worst criminal. And the conversation between him and the grandmother kind of, um, you hear him saying things about himself, about his father, and everything else. Um, but at the end, it kind of begins to dawn on you that, yeah, he probably may have had them killed. Um, right before he kills the grandmother, he talks about how he has been put in prison because the papers say that he has killed his own father. The head doctor, he calls him, he says, he's done bad things in his life and so on. But yeah, I suppose you get very attached to the characters, even though the kids are not all the most nicest kids, but you're presented with the picture of a family nonetheless, young children. And
Mm.
the human in you kind of refuses to believe that these kids, as innocent as they are just killed. Like, why? Um, but the story doesn't care, right? Like, who cares about your feelings? They're gonna die, so deal with it. And that's what happens in the end. And you're like, oh shoot, he shot them. That's terrible. But yeah, yeah. I mean, it is the way it is with stories, really. And
Yeah.
I think it makes for a brilliant story when you cannot say what it is going to happen, and when you're almost you're guessing, you're playing Russian roulette yourself with the characters. Like, is he dead? Is he not? Did they shoot them? Did they not? Yeah, it's just a really good story, and yeah, my story beats your story 10 times. That's just what I was point I
Let
was
me
trying to
tell
make.
you why it doesn't. Right. No, I'm kidding. It isn't really. It's a different thing that they're both doing. And I think it's important, especially when you're doing comparatives, to note the tone. The tone is different for both these texts. The word choices and the tone affect how you feel about the murders. Because a good man is hard to find reads like a family adventure and things like that, but in the end they're all going to be saved. Like a hero is going to come out. A good man is hard to find, almost feels like it's hard to find, but we found one. But that obviously isn't the case. You have that sense of that, oh, a head doctor, so he must have a mental health issue
Mm.
himself. But then alternatively, obviously, and I think more with Misfit than with the narrator in A Telltale Heart, you have the sense that maybe what really happened to Misfit was that he was wrongly accused for something, and this is the consequence of punishing somebody for a crime they didn't commit. And this is the consequence, or that he committed a crime, but it was a small crime, and it turned him into a murderer because he was locked up for so long that it made him go crazy. Uh,
I should, just before you carry on, I on the point of the misfit and his state of mind and all that. There is a line that keeps popping up. She would have been a good woman or something if there had been somebody to shoot her every minute of her life or every second of her life. The misfit says this about the grandmother, that she's not really a good person unless there's somebody there to threaten her life. Like, only when she sees death does she become a good person. And I've heard a lot of people kind of criticize the grandmother so much for being actually a bad person. I don't know what you make of that assertion or that characterization of the grandmother based on the story. That what sense do you get of the grandmother? Because my students, one of them tried to equate the grandmother and the misfit, and I've seen also similar uh, comparisons between the two characters, but I don't know how much I'm comfortable accepting that.
I I would hesitate to call her a villain of the same caliber as Misfit. However, the title Misfit applies to both of them. So the grandmother, you get a palpable sense of her, um, her being a misfit in that family. her son barely talks to her. He ignores her for most of the journey. He ignores her before the journey, he ignores her after the journey, he ignores her during the journey, but she loves him. They don't listen to her about anything unless she's entertaining them. So both the kids are only invested in listening to her at all when she's telling them stories, and even then they're criticizing her stories. The interesting thing I thought was both the grandmother and mother's children, they're not named, they are only their roles. They are the grandmother and the mother's children. Neither one of them have names, but for some reason June Star gets a name, which like I don't know. I don't know about that.
And yeah,
Uh,
why June Star and then John Wesley?
why do they get names? And that's
Is it
interesting
double
because
barrel names or something? I don't
oh,
know.
it's a very fairly common practice in the South. Well, at least it used to be a fairly common practice in the South. It's probably decreasing now, but it still is. It's you know, like Miley is a great example. Why on earth do you have a nickname for a girl whose actual name is Destiny? Are you calling her Miley Cyrus? Like that's like one of those things. But she is a misfit. And in this so the title, I think, you could have like a field day basically just comparing the two of them just based on the title of misfit. Whether she is villainous, however, I think she's
Hmm.
more to me anyway, she read as more like sentimental, too sentimental. She talks about, Tennessee being her home and she doesn't want to really go anywhere else. And then she talks a lot about like, back in the old days, um, you cared about your native state. Uh, you kids don't. How dare? Um, it's obviously it's a generational thing. Every generation thinks that their generation was better. But
Yeah, so let's talk about your text.
Mhm.
I mean, your unexciting text. You're just talking about my text so much. Is
Right.
there anything? Is there anything else you'd like to talk about from your text?
Obviously. Right. So, meanwhile, you have a telltale heart, which the tonal difference is like it's night and day difference. It's more almost humorous. Even the murder is humorous, right? So, in its own way, that's another form of creating an atmosphere of horror that this guy is so casual about it. Like he's
Hmm.
almost playful about it. So in the text, he says, when he kills the old man, he says, he shrieked once only. In an instant, I dragged him to the floor and pulled a heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily to find the deed so far done. But for many minutes, the heartbeat beat on with a muffled sound. This, however, did not vex me. It would not be heard through the wall. At length it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the corpse. Yes, he was stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no more. It's almost like, you know what? I did a thing. It's over now. It's all good,
I
guys.
did a happy thing, a very happy thing. Yeah,
Yeah,
he seems so happy with what he did.
yeah, pretty much. Like mission
Yeah,
accomplished. And in that there is an element of horror. In that, the whole this isn't even a crime. This is just a thing. It's like, oh, and then I put the chicken in the oven, and then it came out as lovely. Oh, the rosemary was really nice. Ah, yes, it's piping hot. Piping hot, absolutely. I put the oven mitts away. Piping hot chicken. It's exactly the same level of the casualness of it. It's not a breach in anything. It is just normal. And in that tone you can find horror, but it's not
hmm.
inherent in the text. It is something that the reader has to bring to the text. The reader knows that murder is horrific, I suppose. So they would have to read the text going like, this bro crazy. But it's not within the text. In the text, this is, just a deed that is done. And that is what he says. The deed's so far done. And that's, it's normal. And I think in that vein, A Telltale Heart is just a lot more fun to read. It's a text where the conversational tone of it makes the murder more like makes the murder natural. It makes the character um almost lovable, which is
No, I knew
absolute.
you were going to say that. That is totally not true, people. She is making that bit up. He is not lovable. He kills somebody, and he's very happy about it. I
He
mean,
did
he's
kill
funny,
somebody.
but
Yeah, he is funny, but like, the whole the conversational tone, the "Oh, please love me, love me, love me" kind of thing. It's almost endearing. And I think that, well, obviously, up to interpretation, how endearing you find that. But there's an you almost I understand why people would read this like this is a child that is, having killed the old man who might potentially be the child's father, because it is a very childish thing to say. I don't think it is a child, simply because, I don't think the police would be completely okay with a child living on their own while the old man is supposedly in the country. That I don't think that's. I think the police would have said something about that. I think it is in fact a servant or some sort of apprentice, that sort of thing, or help. But you know, you could definitely. It's childish. It's a childish voice. It could be that it is, someone who is a helper, but is, adolescent, pre-adolescent. That's also possible. It was Victorian England. This was a common practice to have, a helper who was, young. So especially for the elderly. Um, yeah, I think a telltale heart, though, unlike a good man is hard to find, is a lot more. It lends itself more to close analysis because the vocabulary is so rich comparatively. So in a good man is hard to find, it's more descriptive. And there's a lot of description in a good man is hard to find. The characters are actually described. Like the mother, the children's mother has, like, looks like a cauliflower. It's descriptive, and it's, like description that stays in your head, but you don't really have as much proper description in a telltale heart. You have more description of emotion. So internality is more described than externality. So, by having it be first person and described in such a manner, it increases the supernatural, metaphysical horror, rather than it being, something that's, just normal everyday horror, which is what a good man is hard to find is. It's just normal everyday murder. Whereas with this, it's more almost supernatural, which makes it far more gothic rather than, just this entire family got killed on the road. You know, the the
yeah,
the, the tonal difference, the genre difference, in essence is, is essentially different, the two of the texts.
I think there's something to say about tragedy here as well. Although we're not talking about drama, so the way I look at it usually is that you can differentiate between tragedy and horror. Um, Horror is what happens in a telltale heart, but tragedy is what happens in a good man is hard to find. The
Yes.
number of people that were killed and the unexpected nature of the fact of them dying is just a horror because of the magnitude of death, the circumstances of death. Also, if an old man dies, it's not really that tragic. Old people live and then they die when they're old. That's acceptable to some extent. I get that the murder is horrific. That's true. But the level of tragedy in A Good Man is hard to find. It's different levels of tragedy, like young kids dying, and not just one person in the family, but the whole family, including their grandmother.
Yeah.
That's tragic. Um,
But yeah, it's also important to note that it's the character that we are seeing the world through that dies in A Good Man is Hard to Find. Whereas in A Telltale Heart, the character that dies is someone killed by the character we're seeing the world through. And the reader has almost a natural affinity. Not they don't. I'm not saying that they like the narrator or they sympathize with the narrator. I'm saying that because you see the world through the narrator, you have an affinity for the narrator. just naturally. It just happens because he's the one telling you the story, or she's the one telling you the story, in that sense. So, yeah. So you're
Yeah,
right.
but I think so.
But it was
So yeah, one of the things I'm usually I usually right away latch onto is if I'm reading a text and I'm looking for the tragedy in it. I'm looking at, okay, who is killed? So in a good man, it's hard to find. Let's say it's only the grandmother that is killed. I'm not going to consider it a tragedy. She's a grandmother. She's,
well,
and I know that's
that's a
horrible to
you
say.
problem.
I know that's horrible to say. That's incredibly ageist. But let's be for real. Like if an 80-year-old dies, people go, "Oh, she lived a wonderful life." It's
Wow. Okay.
terrible.
No.
It's
So okay, that
terrible,
I
but
feel
it's not tragic. Aisha,
like
Aisha, don't make me start having old people rush after me like with stones and stuff. I'm not saying that it's okay for the old people to die, but it's kind of okay for old people to die.
okay, you know what? No, King Lear is a tragedy, and the only person that really dies in King Lear that we actually care about is the old man. Like this.
What is his
Yes,
status? What
died,
is
blah,
his
blah, blah.
status? What is his status?
His status is that he's the king, but that's not.
There you
But
go. There you
no,
go.
the thing
But
is, you can have a
this
tragedy
is
with
an
old
old
people dying.
woman. This is an old woman that her family doesn't care about her. And A Telltale Heart is an
Is
old
that
man
not
who lives
tragic?
alone. In
Oh
in
no,
in,
is that not
in
tragic?
No, no, but that's the way you classify tragedy. That the person that dies has to, there has to be a significance with the kind of person who dies. If it's a single person that dies, it can still be a tragedy, depending on who the person is. If it's a king, it's a tragedy. If it's a regular man, it's not a tragedy. If a whole family dies, it's a tragedy. If a grandmother dies, it's not a tragedy. I usually classify tragedy based on either number or on the status of the person. If today I die, it's not a tragedy. It's not a tragedy. I'm nobody still, and yet I'm not somebody. When I do become somebody, and if I die, that becomes a tragedy because somebody huge has died. Everybody cares about it. But the old man in Telltale Heart and the grandmother in A Good Man is Hard to Find. If those individuals are to die, not many people would typically care.
Okay, so what you're doing is using the Aristotelian definition of a tragedy and
Exactly,
applying it to
exactly.
what we consider tragedy today. So the Aristotelian definition of tragedy was that tragedy is a branch of drama that treats a serious and dignified style in a serious and dignified style the sorrowful or terrible events encountered or caused by a heroic individual. And heroes tend to be kings and that sort of thing. They're not usually like the common man. The the but but tragedy understood in this day and age, especially just something is really tragic. That's more something an unhappy ending happens. Like the downfall of the main character. Just death in general, and the whole idea of this person needs to be
Um,
a
so you
valuable
said you used a
individual.
word there. You said an unhappy ending. If I read A Good Man, it's hard to find. It's totally unhappy. Kids are dying, left, right, and center. If I if I read The Telltale Heart, I'm like, oh yeah, an old man dies. You know,
I'm not saying that
that's
the Telltale Heart is a tragedy. It is absolutely not a tragedy. No,
no.
not even.
I think it's a tragedy personally.
You think
The,
Telltale
yeah,
Heart is
yeah. So no, 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 no. A Good Man is hard to find is a tragedy. A
oh
Telltale
no,
Heart
it was hard
is
to
a
find.
horror
Yes, no, I
fiction.
agree with you. However, I don't agree with you saying that just because it's the old woman that died that you wouldn't care. Because you can have a
I
tragedy
think I think we
with
win.
just the grandmother having died. You can't have a tragedy. Like this is it would be tragic. This is
No,
bro.
it's good we're finally having a disagreement. I think if just the old woman, the grandmother dies, nobody cares. I mean,
No,
when
that's
the
just you being
so when the
unsympathetic.
look, all my grandmothers are dead, so they're not going to care about this. The point is, you can't say this if you still have grandparents alive. That would be totally weird. But the point I'm trying to make is like when they have the accident, right? The kids are almost upset that nobody died when they see the grandmother crawls out of the car
These are
and
such
she's
nice kids.
and she's holding her hat, right? Why do you think they think that? Even they think that, you know, if the grandmother were to die, that would be normal. That's kind of what is expected in
Oh
action.
my God. They weren't saying that, oh, the grandmother dead. They just wanted somebody dead because otherwise it's not like an actual.
Preferably the grandmother, because if you look at what happens, is immediately they make that statement where we kind of like, if it was a movie, the camera would just pan out to the grandmother crawling out of the car, because that's what is described. It's almost as if they're looking at the car and they see the grandmother come out and they're like, oh, nobody died. What do you think they want to die? I don't think they want their father or mother to die, or the
I don't think they
baby.
cared. I think the children genuinely didn't care who would have died. They were just like, oh, nobody died.
I think they really don't like their grandmother.
I
Like,
don't think they hate their grandmother either, though, because they actually listen to the grandmother stories. Like they just,
mm,
passively take her for granted. That's
mm.
different. And I think
But
that's
you
a,
think if you were to ask,
know,
June Star, and John Wesley, who who should die in the crash, who do you think they would say?
I don't think they would have. I don't think they would have said anybody. They would just been like, somebody should have died. Like otherwise, why on earth would you even crash the car? Honestly, people. I think I genuinely thought that the mother would have been dead because just after the mother's children was described, then the kids were like, "Oh, nobody died," and I was like, "Oh, okay, good, nobody died," because the mother's children fell out of the car, right? That's
Mm,
something. Yeah, it was more likely for her to have died, especially because she was a minor character. She doesn't
yeah,
even have
very
a
minor. Yeah.
yeah, and you disappeared. Uh, And yeah, so even like I don't agree with the idea that just because children died, it is tragic. That's a very Victorian sentiment. It's the fact that anybody dies with enough pathos, that turns into a tragedy. And pathos is key. You need to feel for the character. The character needs to not be like a side character or a villainous character. Well, actually, it can be villainous and it can still be a tragedy. But the idea that, like a villain with a heart sort of thing. You need the audience needs to care for the character for it to be a tragedy. If the audience doesn't really care for the character, if the character is vulgar or whatever, it still classifies as a comedy if a character like that dies, by Aristotelian definitions of comedy and tragedy. So yeah, both A Telltale Heart and A Good Man is Hard to Find have very specific short story characteristics, which I think, going forward, whenever you look at a short story, you have to think about the economy of words and therefore word choices. Short stories definitely lend themselves to close analysis because of this aspect. You zoom into a paragraph and you can probably discuss the entire short story within the context of those few sentences. And that's the characteristic of a short story precisely because it is so short. Everything has to be connected. There are no plot points that are left untethered or unthought of or untied. They're all it's cohesive and cogent. So that's a characteristic of a short story. Another one is that it usually has a purpose. It always has a singular purpose. It doesn't usually have more than one purpose, largely because there isn't as much space to explore more than one purpose. It also tends to have very few characters, and therefore, because otherwise you can't do proper characterization. If there are many characters within a short story, you don't have the space to explore them properly. And we did discuss that in a previous lecture. You need less characters to go in depth into them. And for stories, depth is far more important than breadth, although there are obviously books that go in do breadths brilliantly. They tend to be very long stories. They don't tend to you know they don't tend to be short ones, because shorter stories tend to have less space. You also have to ask yourself why the description is happening in a short story. Why, if there is more than one sentence of description, or a very brief description, why have they done a proper description? Thank you so much for listening and for engaging with these texts. I'm really glad to have been given the opportunity to give these lectures. I hope you ask me to do something else, because I really do enjoy reading texts and dissecting them. Thank you for following the series. This has been a Soundbound media production for the Kasu Pod Project. Thank you for following the series. This has been a Soundbound media production for the Kasu Pod Project.